Hey everyone, welcome back to the Deep Dive by Cognitive Curves. Today we're tackling a topic that touches us all at some point, dealing with the loss of a cherished person, a psychological perspective. Joining us, we have Emily, who specializes in cognitive psychology and consumer behavior, and Ryan, an expert in neuropsychology. Their voices bring to life the knowledge and insights from experts in these fields, designed to help you navigate the complexities of grief and find meaning amidst the pain. Let's dive in.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving into something, well, it's a tough topic, but a really important one. How do we deal with the loss of someone we love?
It's a part of life that everyone experiences at some point, and yet it's often so hard to talk about.
Yeah, it's almost like we're afraid to even bring it up. But, we all go through it. So for this deep dive, we're going to be looking at an academic essay. It's called Dealing with the Loss of a Cherished Person, a Psychological Perspective.
We're not going to get all academic and stuffy, though.
Right. We want this to be more like a conversation, exploring the different ways people cope and find meaning and even grow after a loss. It's fascinating stuff, actually.
It really is. And there are so many misconceptions about grief. Like, I'm sure you've heard of those famous stages of grief.
Yeah, the stages. Is that really how it works, though? I always wondered.
That's a great question. Let's go back in time a bit and start with Sigmund Freud. He was one of the first to really try to understand grief.
Freud. Okay, so we're talking like early 1900s.
Yeah, back in 1917, he wrote about the difference between mourning and what he called melancholia.
Mourning and melancholia. Okay. I'm intrigued. So what did he say about them?
Well, he saw mourning as a healthy process, slowly detaching from the person you've lost. It's about gradually taking back your emotional energy so you can reinvest it in other relationships and things that matter to you.
It's like untangling yourself from that person, but not forgetting them.
Exactly. It's about finding a way to live without them. But then there's melancholia. Freud saw that as more of a pathological kind of grief. It's when you get stuck in that detachment process and the sadness just becomes overwhelming.
But it takes over your whole life.
Exactly. And that brings us to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and her famous 5 stages of grief.
Oh, yeah. Those denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance.
You got it. Her book on death and dying became a huge bestseller in 1969, and everyone's heard of those stages.
But are they really like a roadmap for grief, though? Is it that straightforward?
That's a good question. And honestly, it's been criticized for being too rigid and linear. Like, everyone goes through these stages in a set order. It just doesn't always work that way.
It's not like checking off a to-do list, right? Grief is way messier than that.
Exactly. It's more nuanced. It's like you're on a winding path, not a straight line.
Okay, that's a much better analogy.
Yeah.
So if not stages, then what? How do we make sense of this winding path then?
Well, more recent research suggests that grief might look different for everyone. George Bonanno, for instance, has done some fascinating work on resilience.
Resilience. Interesting. Okay, so what's that all about?
His research shows that a lot of people don't actually go through those stages in a specific order. Instead, they experience grief more in waves.
Waves. So like you're going along feeling okay, and then suddenly, bam, this wave of sadness just hits you.
Precisely. And those waves can come out of nowhere and vary in intensity. But here's the thing, even with those waves, a lot of people can still function pretty normally between them, and pretty incredible, actually.
That's encouraging to hear. So you don't necessarily get stuck in this constant state of sadness.
Not at all. And there are other models out there that offer even more nuanced perspectives on grief. One that's really helpful is called the dual process model.
Okay, the dual process model. Tell me more.
This model was developed by Margaret Straub and Hank Schett, and it suggests that we're actually going back and forth between 2 different coping processes.
2 processes. Okay. All ears. Lay it on me.
The first one is called the loss-oriented process, and this is where you're really confronting the loss head-on. You let yourself experience those really raw, intense feelings of sadness, the yearning, missing the person you've lost.
It's like you're allowing yourself to fully grieve, to just feel it all.
Exactly. But then there's the second process called the restoration-oriented process. This one's more about adapting to life without the person who's gone. It could involve taking on new roles, new responsibilities, or finding new sources of meaning and purpose.
It's like you're trying to find your footing in this new landscape without that person.
That's a great way to put it. And the important thing is that we naturally move between these 2 processes.
So you're not picking one and sticking with it.
Yeah.
It's more about finding a balance.
You got it. And it's that flexibility that helps us navigate the ups and downs of grief. Sometimes you need to let those feelings wash over you, and sometimes you need to focus on the practicalities of life. Both are completely normal.
That actually makes me feel a lot better knowing that there's no one right way to grieve. You know, one minute you might be feeling lost and heartbroken, and the next you might find yourself laughing with friends.
Exactly. It's a dynamic process, and honoring both sides of that is what allows us to heal and eventually move forward.
Wow. I already feel like I have a much better understanding of how grief works. It's so much more complex and fluid than I ever realized.
It really is. And we're just getting started because here's something to think about. Grief doesn't just affect us emotionally. It can also have a big impact on our mental health.
Yeah, we're not just talking about feeling sad here. There can be some serious mental health challenges that come with grief.
Absolutely. And that's something we need to talk about openly and honestly.
Okay, let's dive into that then. What are some of the mental health challenges that can come up after a loss?
So for some people, the grief they experience becomes so intense it can be really debilitating. It's what we call complicated grief, or sometimes it's called prolonged grief disorder.
Complicated grief, is that like when the grief just doesn't go away?
That's a good way to put it. It's when the feelings of loss and yearning are so strong and so persistent that they start to interfere with your daily life. It's like grief takes over your whole world.
I can only imagine how exhausting that must be.
It really is. And unfortunately, complicated grief is linked to a higher risk of other mental health issues, too. Things like depression, anxiety, and even substance abuse.
It's like one thing leads to another.
Exactly. And it's not just our mental health that's affected either. Complicated grief can even increase the risk of physical health problems like heart disease.
Wow, grief really can affect us on so many levels.
It's true. And it's important to remember that there are different types of grief-related depression. For example, you've got bereavement-related depression, and then there's major depressive disorder.
Okay, those sound pretty similar. What's the difference between them?
Well, they do have some overlapping symptoms, but bereavement-related depression tends to be very focused on the person who died. It often involves those really big existential questions, about life and death and what it all means.
So it's like the sadness is all tangled up with these deeper philosophical questions.
Exactly. And sometimes grief can be tied to trauma, too, especially if the loss was sudden or violent. That's where PTSD can come into play.
Right. It's not just the loss itself, but the circumstances surrounding it that can be traumatic.
Exactly. Someone with PTSD might experience flashbacks or nightmares. They might feel constantly on edge or hypervigilant. All of that can make it even harder to cope with the grief.
This is all pretty heavy stuff. I bet some of our listeners are feeling a little overwhelmed right now. But what I really want to know is, what can people do if they're struggling? Are there ways to work through this and find some healing?
Absolutely. There are so many different coping mechanisms and therapies that can help people navigate their grief and move forward. That's what's so hopeful about this. There is help available.
Okay, let's talk about that. What are some healthy ways to cope with loss? What can people do to take care of themselves during this time?
Well, one really important approach is called active coping. Instead of trying to ignore or suppress your grief, you actively engage with it.
So it's about facing those feelings head on.
Exactly. It involves things like reaching out for support, talking about your feelings with others, and finding activities that bring you comfort or a sense of purpose.
It's about finding healthy outlets for those emotions, whether it's through talking, writing, creating, or connecting with others.
You got it. And there are some specific therapeutic approaches that can be really helpful. For instance, cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, is a really common and effective one.
I've heard of CBT being used for anxiety and depression, but how does it work for grief?
Well, CBT can help you reframe those negative thoughts and break free from those cycles of rumination that can keep you feeling stuck.
So it's about challenging those thought patterns that can make the grief feel even worse.
Exactly. Let's say someone keeps thinking, if only I had done this differently, they wouldn't have died. CBT can help them challenge that kind of thinking and replace it with a more balanced perspective.
So it's about being kinder to yourself and recognizing that you can't control everything.
Exactly. And another powerful approach is narrative therapy. It's based on the idea that telling your story can actually help you process what happened.
Yeah, I can see how putting those experiences into words could help make sense of them.
Right. So in narrative therapy, you work with a therapist to tell and retell the story of the loss. It helps you integrate that story into your overall life story and find a place for it. That can help reduce the intensity of the grief and even lead to a renewed sense of purpose.
So it's not about erasing the story, but finding a way to weave it into the fabric of your life.
Exactly. And then you've got those mindfulness and acceptance-based therapies like mindfulness-based stress reduction, or MBSR and acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT.
I've heard of those, but usually in the context of stress management. How do they apply to grief?
They're all about learning to be present with your grief without judging yourself. You're not trying to force the grief away, but rather you're learning to simply observe those difficult feelings without being completely consumed by them.
So you're creating space for the grief while also recognizing that you're not defined by it.
That's a great way to put it. And ACT specifically focuses on accepting the pain of loss while also committing to living a meaningful life in spite of it. It's about taking action even when things are hard.
It's about finding that balance between honoring your grief and moving forward in life.
Exactly. And of course, social support is absolutely essential during times of loss. Having those people you can lean on and talk to without judgment can make a world of difference.
It seems like having those connections, those relationships, can really help you through those tough times.
It definitely does. And for some people, bereavement support groups can be incredibly valuable. Sharing your experiences with others who truly understand what you're going through can be incredibly healing.
It's about finding a community where you feel seen and heard and supported.
You got it. And you know what's really interesting? In addition to these coping mechanisms and therapies, research has shown that people can actually experience growth after loss.
Growth. Really? That's not something I would have expected. I mean, loss seems so inherently negative.
It does. But there's this concept called post-traumatic growth. It suggests that going through a major life challenge, like losing a loved one, can actually lead to positive psychological changes.
It's like you go through the fire and you come out stronger on the other side.
That's a great way to put it. It's about finding those unexpected gifts hidden within the pain.
That's such a powerful way to look at it.
Yeah.
So what kind of growth are we talking about? What are some examples?
Well, people might develop a deeper appreciation for life. Their relationships might become stronger. They might find a new sense of purpose or even experience a spiritual awakening.
It's like the loss shakes things up and makes you rethink what's truly important. You can change your priorities and lead you down a new path.
Exactly. And it's connected to Viktor Frankl's concept of logotherapy. He was a Holocaust survivor who became a famous psychiatrist.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of him. He wrote Man's Search for Meaning, right?
That's the one. And through his own experiences, Frankl came to believe that finding meaning in our suffering is essential to enduring and overcoming it.
That's a really powerful insight. So how does this apply to dealing with loss?
Well, people might find meaning in creating rituals to honor the person who died. Maybe they dedicate themselves to causes that were important to that person. Or maybe they just reassess their own priorities and start living a life that's more aligned with their values.
It's like turning the pain into something positive, something that motivates you to move forward.
Yes. It's about honoring the person you lost by living a life that reflects what they stood for or the lessons you learned from them.
Wow, that's incredible. So even though grief can be so difficult and painful, there's also this potential for growth and transformation. I love that we're ending on such a hopeful note.
I agree. It's important to remember that even in those moments of deep sorrow, there's always a flicker of light, a chance for something beautiful to come out of the darkness.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about Freud's theories, modern research on resilience, and even the concept of post-traumatic growth.
Yeah.
It's been a fascinating look at the complex world of grief.
And I think the biggest takeaway here is that grief is a deeply personal experience. There's no single right way to grieve, and it's a process that takes time.
It's not a race.
Yeah.
There's no finish line.
Yeah.
And your path through grief might look very different from someone else's path.
Exactly. And comparing your grief to others is never helpful. It's all about honoring your own individual journey.
So it's about finding what works for you, whether it's talking things out, seeking professional help, or finding comfort in quiet reflection.
Exactly. And if you're feeling lost or overwhelmed, please remember that you don't have to go through this alone. There are so many resources out there to help you through this.
It's not a sign of weakness to ask for help. In fact, it takes a lot of strength to admit that you need support.
Absolutely. And while we've talked about some pretty heavy stuff today, I think there's a lot of hope in all of this. It's not about pretending the pain doesn't exist, but about recognizing that you can still find meaning and joy in life even after a loss.
That's such a crucial message. It's about acknowledging the pain while also holding on to the possibility of healing and growth. And speaking of growth, you mentioned earlier that many people experience what's called post-traumatic growth after a loss. Can you tell me a little more about that?
It is pretty amazing. It's like, you know how you hear stories about people going through something really tough and they come out the other side like a totally different person, maybe even stronger. That's kind of what post-traumatic growth is like.
So you're not just coping, you're actually thriving after a loss.
Exactly. You might find that you have a new appreciation for life, like really seeing how precious it is, or your relationships could become even stronger, or maybe you'll find a new purpose in life. It's like The loss kind of forces you to take a step back and reevaluate what really matters.
It makes you rethink your priorities.
Right. And it reminds me of what Viktor Frankl said. He said, man's search for meaning is the primary motivation in his life.
He was talking about finding those reasons to keep going, even in the face of terrible suffering.
Exactly. And that's what I find so fascinating about grief. It can be so devastating, but it can also lead to some really profound changes.
Yeah. I got to say, this whole conversation has been a real roller coaster of emotions. But I'm feeling a lot more hopeful now than I did when we started.
Me too. It's a reminder that even when things feel incredibly dark, there's always a possibility for something positive to come out of it.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from all of this?
I think the most important thing to remember is that everyone grieves differently. There's no right or wrong way to do it. Don't compare your experience to anyone else's.
It's your own unique journey.
Exactly. Some people find comfort in talking about their loss with others, while others need some time alone. Some people find solace in rituals and traditions, while others prefer to just keep busy. It's all about finding what works for you.
And if you're feeling lost or overwhelmed, just remember that you don't have to go through this alone.
Right. There are therapists and support groups and even online communities where you can connect with others who understand what you're going through. Reaching out for support is actually a sign of strength, not weakness.
It takes courage to admit that you need help.
Absolutely. And while we've covered some heavy topics today, I really do believe that there's a lot of hope to be found in understanding grief. It's not about pretending the pain isn't there. It's about recognizing that you can still find meaning and joy in life, even after experiencing a loss.
That's a great message to end on. It's about acknowledging the pain while also holding on to that possibility for healing and growth. Thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
Grief is a deeply personal journey, and there's no right or wrong way to experience it. We hope today's episode brought you some comfort and clarity. If you found this discussion helpful, subscribe to Cognitive Curves for more episodes exploring the psychology of life's challenges. And if you know someone who could benefit from this conversation, feel free to share. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive, and we'll see you next time.